Hi everyone, my name is Katherine Mary Jones and I'm a PhD student at the University of Bristol. I would like to present to you our paper entitled I Don't Really Get Involved in That Way, investigating blind and visually impaired individuals' experiences of joint attention with sighted people. In this work, we explore joint attention in blind and visually impaired children and adults through interviews and video analysis. We do this so that we can make informed suggestions when designing technology to support this phenomena. To best understand the concepts of joint attention, I will describe a scenario for you. Imagine you're in a park playing ball with your sighted friend. Catch, your friend calls, and you catch the ball and then throw it back. This is a classic joint attention triad where you need to pay attention to each other and the ball. It involves sight, movement, touch, and verbal communication. You become distracted by a movement in the corner of your eye. Look, you exclaim, pointing at a bird in the sky. It is very colourful, unusual for a city park. Ooh, pretty, your friend says, and you start discussing what type of bird it might be. The joint attention triad for the ball broke down once you stopped paying attention to it, but the phenomena picked up again as you both start paying attention to and commenting on the bird. Here, the triad involved sight, physical gestures, and verbal communication, but no touch. A few days later, you're in the park again, playing ball with a different friend who has no sight. This game is achievable because the ball jingles so your friend can locate it using sound. The lack of vision may somewhat degrade the joint attention triad, but it persists successfully. You notice the bird again, and momentarily forgetting your friend's lack of vision, you call, "Look!" In the case of the bird, vision and touch are not possible, resulting in a breakdown of the joint attention triad. At that moment, the bird lets out a trill, and your friend says, "It sounds nice." The joint attention triad is re-established using audition. When we started this research journey, we quickly realised that exploration into joint attention had mostly focused on interactions between sighted people and blind or visually impaired infants. However, there's very little research to understand a blind or visually impaired person's experience of joint attention beyond the age of 5. Coincidentally, this is the age that distance between two people changes and moves out of the peripersonal space, meaning that touch is greatly reduced. To date, technology has focused mainly on navigation and support in the workplace. More recently, design has started moving towards technology in the larger social space. Two examples include the Abbey, a wristwatch worn by blind or visually impaired children that gives auditory cues about their environment, and the People Lens, a device designed for children that is worn on the head and provides auditory information about the people in their environment. However, even though these devices could be used in social situations, they would benefit greatly from looking at how blind and visually impaired people experience joint attention. The knowledge and understanding of joint attention experiences for blind and visually impaired people might go further to informing these designs. To address this gap, we aim to answer two research questions. In the first, we ask how blind and visually impaired individuals perceive barriers to engaging in joint attention with sighted peers throughout their childhood and adult lived experiences. To address the first research question, we conducted semi-structured interviews that lasted between 30 minutes and 1 hour. We spoke to 10 blind and visually impaired individuals about their experiences engaging in joint attention with sighted peers, and questions included their joint attention experiences with sighted people from childhood to adulthood. For the interview study, we used reflexive thematic analysis to identify initial codes which we put into 5 main themes, namely the relief of proximity, good use of language, group size, responsibility on oneself, and a lack of joint attention opportunities. There were many insightful quotes from the participants that enabled us to create these themes. For example, when talking about proximity, one participant said, "You can really sense the presence of somebody else," she explained, "and I think the shift of the air, that's a sense of connection for me." When talking about language, it was observed that the vulgarity of language can be quite frustrating. It does require a level of mindfulness a lot of people aren't capable of. Mindfulness of the world which they exist, the names of objects, how to estimate distance, how to describe it, this constant verbal recall that's required in order to communicate things that I think we're just not sort of trained to do in society. For group size, one participant said, "In a larger group, I don't know if they're talking to me unless they say my name because I can't see who they're looking at." There was a strong sense that the responsibility lay on the blind and visually impaired person to begin interactions, and frequent reflection that they felt not good enough, with one participant recalling a perceived friend as saying, "I can't always hang around with you, I'm not here to look after you." And finally, there was a prominent sense of a void, a lack of joint attention opportunity, with one person reflecting, "I don't tend to really get involved in that way if I don't know the person, because the way I feel is, how can I explain to them what I want? They don't know me, they don't know what I want to do." These findings indicate to us that the lack of opportunities was caused in the first instance by difficulties in initiating joint attention, and this established the focus of study for the next research question. In the second research question, we asked how we should understand and characterise mechanisms and indicators of successful initiation of joint attention between blind and visually impaired and sighted people. This was done through video analysis of up to 5-minute-long home or school videos, where blind and visually impaired children were asked to take part in joint attention-rich activities with family, friends, or teachers. The participants included 4 blind and visually impaired children and 10 sighted participants. For the analysis, we combined inductive and deductive coding. The deductive coding was drawn from Alfaro et al.'s 2018 work on joint attention in blind and visually impaired infants. Alfaro described coordinated joint attention events where both parties were equally involved in the activity, and supported joint attention events in which the activity is more reliant on the input of one person and the other takes a more passive role. Inductive coding was used to create low-level modalities of interaction. Here we identified the movements that the participants took during joint attention-rich activities, signals such as verbal prompt, orientation, pointing, reinforced by a tap for sound, and inhalation of breath before speaking, and speaking itself, were identified as some of the cues important for the successful initiation of joint attention. We continued to use inductive coding to establish a higher level of joint attention locus in order to identify who was speaking, whether they were orientated towards the other person, or whether they were orientated towards the object. Finally, we expanded on Alfaro et al.'s 2018 categories of joint attention to determine which types of joint attention had been initiated. We identified whether it had been the blind or visually impaired child or their sighted peer that had initiated the episode, as well as the type of episode it led to. Here, the initiation led either to a coordinated episode of joint attention where both parties are contributing to the event almost equally using speech, touch, and other modalities, or supported joint attention, a slightly more one-sided event with the blind or visually impaired child relying on the sighted peer to guide the activity. At this level, we found that only children with speech initiated coordinated joint attention. Furthermore, children without speech initiated significantly less for both types of engagement. The overall findings told us that when it came to initiating joint attention, the blind and visually impaired child orientated towards the object the most, the sighted peers spoke about the object the most, and finally, there were notably fewer joint attention events initiated by the blind and visually impaired child than by their sighted peers. To conclude the paper, we discussed the following design insights. We asked that we manage the tension between supporting orientation feedback and avoiding masking and sensory overload, to consider reach in the absence of touch and vision, and consider form factors and signalling, whether technology should be wearable, embedded in the environment, or both. For example, feedback such as light for the sighted partner. And following on from this, that it is important to consider explicit support for both the blind and visually impaired person and the sighted joint attention partners. This concludes our paper, I Don't Really Get Involved in That Way, investigating blind and visually impaired individuals' experiences of joint attention with sighted people. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to presenting again in Hawaii CHI 2024.